For many women, childbirth is its own gross-out story. Just when you think you've heard the grossest birth story, something more horrific finds its way into your life. I'm not here to play one-ups with the mothers in the room. You have my full respect for your gross birth story. You pooped in your doctor's face. You tore so badly you possibly had one hole for everything. Or you won this contest by leaving the hospital with your afterbirth in tow. I hear you, and I never had a vaginal birth, and I pretended that the afterbirth didn't exist. So I will never compete with vaginal birth stories. Instead, I'm going to tell you about a love story between me and my gynecologist. Because as far as bragging rights go, I have it on good authority that I am his gross-out story. In 2006, I was pregnant with the second of my 3 sons. My first son was delivered by emergency C-section because I had the gestation period of an elephant. So when they tried to force this elephant into labor at 42 weeks, my body revolted and my cervix swelled, making the normal passage of a baby impossible. It made me sad and angry and lots of other feelings for many months afterward. So when I became pregnant with my second son, I decided I would try to change the outcome instead of accepting a planned cesarean. I went on a mission during my second pregnancy to find a doctor who would support me in having a VBAC, which is a vaginal birth after cesarean. I found him and I immediately loved him. He looked a lot like Dobber from the hit sitcom Coach. He also did not like arbitrary and sweeping rules imposed by hospital boards. So long story short, he agreed to be my champion and let me try labor. When I arrived at the hospital after he broke my water at 41 weeks with no sign of labor, the nurses learned of my previous C-section and turned on me like I had come in shit-can drunk with a cigarette hanging out of my mouth. They told me I was risking killing my elephant calf with my selfish attempt at a vaginal birth and gave me so much shit that I was in tears before I even got my hospital gown on. I went into my induced labor a wreck, and things went downhill from there. My confidence in my body was shot, my confidence in my doctor was iffy, and as soon as my blood pressure even considered spiking, I decided to go for the C-section. But this was 12 hours in, and I had already labored, and my body and my mind had been through quite a lot. I was physically and emotionally stressed and emotionally vulnerable, and I was pissed. Predictably, my elephant calf came out pissed. And anyone who knows him today can attest that this temperament, for better or for worse, has never left him. 3 days later, I was ready to go home. I told Dobber that I was having pain on my left side. He assured me that this was normal and anesthesia often wears off at different rates on different sides of the body. This did and still does seem legit. Dobber always listened to me and respected me, and I do not in any way hold him accountable for what went on inside my body. Right or wrong, I still lay that at the feet of those asshole nurses. I ran a low-grade fever for about a week after I went home and tried to nurse my baby and heal. Deep down, though, I knew something was wrong. And finally, I had my husband Ezra take me to the emergency room. My fever was not high enough to warrant alarm, so I had to moan and wail until they agreed to call Dobber, who ordered an ultrasound. And I am quoting the 2 doctors who did find something unusual, and they were standing next to me. We're all looking at it, and they said, "Well, there is a mass there, but we're pretty sure over time that her body will absorb it." And I wondered out loud, well, why hasn't it done it yet then? Because move along, mass, I don't feel good. And they decided to ignore me, because what did I know anyway? It wasn't the body that I've been living in for the last 29 years. So they sent me home, and 2 days later, I had a fever of 104 and I could barely stand. So I called Dobber, and he met me at the hospital, where I stayed for the next 6 days with a raging infection at my cesarean at the surgery site. I was put on a push button of IV Demerol, which almost makes the whole thing worth it. I felt a little better because I was now essentially a morphine junkie, but the infection was going nowhere. Let me tell you about my experience being a morphine junkie for a week. After 3 days of the antibiotics not working, I was losing hope that I could fight off the infection, which meant that I would eventually become septic and die. And this led to intense anxiety that my children would grow up without a mother. My husband would be left to raise the children alone until he met his next wife, who would probably be much more attractive, not have a temper problem, and probably be better in bed because people learn lessons. Then, though, I would push that button and new thoughts would take over. And I'd think, you know what? People don't need biological mothers. They're really overrated. Maybe they'll get like a Brady Bunch situation. They'll have Alice, and she'll make trays of snacks. And who cares? Because I have a Demerol pump, and that's a stroke of luck when you die. Clearly I lived. I was sent home with Demerol pills, which do not count, and they were one of the largest disappointments of my entire life. But before I left, things got much worse. At some point during the early days of my stay, Dobber made one of his twice-daily trips to check on me and saw my Rolling Stone magazine on the floor beside my bed. Inexplicably, because he was already irrelevant at this time, Eddie Vedder was on the cover. Eddie Vedder is the lead singer of a terrible grunge band called Pearl Jam. I hate him and I hate their music. I have felt this hate since the first time I heard them, and it has never subsided. If anything, it's gotten stronger. If you are considering getting torches and forming a mob in defense of Pearl Jam, don't bother. I've been kicked out of parties dating back to the mid-90s for pissing off Pearl Jam fans. I know about the passion of the Pearl Jam fan. Dobber, however, did not know this about me. He started in about the genius of Eddie Vedder, which made me turn on him about the entire genre, spare Nirvana, and it was then that I discovered Dobber's true passion, which is not obstetrics or gynecology. It is trying to make a very sick woman convert to a fan of terrible shit like Temple of the Dog, which is another 90s band from Seattle that I hate. Ladies and gentlemen, of all the weird things that have ever happened to me, one of my favorite is that my gynecologist made me a mixtape. It was not romantic in nature, unless you count his intense and borderline sexual feelings for Eddie Vedder. It was grunge propaganda, ineffective grunge propaganda. I did listen to it, and it did make my infection worse. 4 days into my hospital stay, Dobber sat on the edge of my bed and said that in the olden days they would have filleted me open to see what they were working with, but the open air could expose me to further infection. He was trying to be conservative and clinging to hope that the antibiotics might work. It was then that I grabbed his shirt like a lunatic and said, "Stop being conservative. It's getting us nowhere. I think I'm going to die." He said the next morning, if there was no improvement, he would reopen my cesarean wound. The next morning, he assembled a natural disaster team. He asked the 2 nurses with him if they had strong stomachs, and then he sent them to go gather all the towels. My husband made the foolish decision to stay by my side in the hospital room while they did the procedure. I was given extra Demerol, and Dobber began what would possibly be the most disgusting experience of his entire career. He made a broad cut with the scalpel across my abdomen, and then something that should only happen at Yellowstone occurred. A pus geyser. The contents of a 3-week-old festering infection shot out of my body. And when it kind of subsided and he got it under control, everyone was about to barf. He immediately yelled for someone to please open the window. I did not know the hospital windows opened. I thought it was like Vegas. And they sealed them so that people who don't have Demerol pumps and are in a terrible situation can't throw themselves to their death. I, for one, could not smell and did not care because I had an amazing high. They packed my wound and tried to put back the pieces of their shattered lives. Unfortunately, the worst was still to come for Ezra. To save me daily trips to the wound care clinic, He was charged with unpacking and repacking my wound. It had to heal from the back to the front, and it was very deep. I couldn't see anything down there because having gained 60 pounds with the pregnancy, it was impossible to get a viewing of that, which I didn't want anyway. But he would have to open it, and then look in there, it sounded very cavernous when he described it. Pull it all out, and then stuff it all back in. He said it was the stuff of nightmares, but I would not allow him to describe it to me. I thought that this would be the most humiliating time of motherhood for me, but I was wrong because children are mean. And when the child whose birth that almost killed me was 3 years old, I had to take him bra shopping with me. And while I'm trying on bra after bra, we're in the changing room, he finally decides in his horrible brain that he has to ask this question. Mommy, what are the red things on the end of your fat things? And I looked at him and I said, nipples. They're nipples, monster. And then, not to be outdone, when his little brother, the youngest, was about that age, he pushes into the bathroom like he owns the place. I just got out of the shower. I'm leaning over my legs, putting on lotion, no clothes. It's not pretty. He throws open the door, and I stop myself from saying, "Why, get the fuck out of here," which I thought was nice of me. And I agree, it's not pretty, but I did not deserve this. And he looks at me, he points one of his little demon hands at me, and he says, "Mommy, can you lift those?" At 3 years old, the sight of the body that fed him for the entire first year of his life so offends him that he suggested plastic surgery to me. I will never forgive those nurses or my children for turning me into a gross out story. Thank you.